Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. In this instance, we start with a conjecture about the digitization of our world, of our practice world in particular. And that led to some pretty interesting conjectures and speculations and opinions about how the white water of digitized world experience is running faster and producing more challenges for us to stay afloat and keep looking ahead, anticipating, and then closing whatever performance gaps we must before it's too late. Sounds a little gloomy, but it really isn't. I think there's a lot of meat on the bones of this particular reflection. So hope you agree. Well, here we are in our 8th episode of conversation about the nature of practice. So one of the very intriguing elements of conjectures that we keep stopping at over this collaboration going, digitization. What?
First thing we need to learn to do is pronounce it.
Yeah, so you pronounce it first and let me hear it, and I'll do it right.
Digitization.
Digitization. Okay, that's the one. So I thought we could put this back to our fundamental meaning for practice and then work it from there. So once again,
this is now the working way of thinking we have about practice.
Right. Working way of thinking. Practice is the conscious ability, fairly consistently, to produce intended results. Let me stop there a minute. Produce intended results. That was true 50 years ago, 40, 30, 20. It's true today. It's always about producing intended results. The difference is that each one of those decades, two parts. First, the results that we're trying to produce in practice today tend to be far more demanding, far more esoteric in some ways. Why? Because change is happening so fast. As soon as you achieve a result, it's already obsolete, it's already gone by, it's already a moment too late. So that's a bit of exaggeration. On the other side of it, though, intended results, the intention never lets up. We still have to hold on, no matter what, to wanting to produce the results, and to do so across a range of circumstances, and to do so while growing and changing oneself to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. Changing circumstances. Digitization. Some things drive change faster than others, but as soon as they figured out, not too long ago, how to turn zeros and ones into code, and then turn code into something that makes these devices of ours work,
within our lifetimes,
there it went. So let's start a little reminiscing. Can you remember, Peter, when you first, as a teacher, heard say that we're going to be moving some of our instruction from the classroom and putting it up on this thing called the web?
I think I almost can pinpoint it exactly. In 2008, May or June of 2008 was the first time I heard about it. And the reason I heard about it was because I was retiring. And I confess that I had the feeling, gosh, I'm glad I don't have to go through that, because I couldn't in the first instance exactly see how my teaching style and content and the assorted handouts and overheads and so forth that I utilize, how those were all going to be affected by putting the content of the course on a web page. And I had some experience before with having the whole class basically on the same email address. And it had a name. I'm trying to think what we called it.
Microsoft Notes, or there's a distribution system.
Yeah.
One of those things.
but that was a very primitive example. But even there, I discovered a dramatic change in the behavior of the class when it was augmented with the ability to talk to each other outside of class time, knowing that the instructor was online also, and that so that they were kind of reciting, but not really. They were chatting with each other.
Mhm.
And one of the things I discovered immediately, I happened to have probably 1/3 of my class. These were MBA students in Washington, D.C. 1/3 of the class were Asians, and maybe not a third, let's say a quarter were Asians. So you had 7 or 8 or 10 Asians who never talked. It was like pulling teeth to get them to talk in class. And yet, when you put them onto these extra class email systems, they became chatty as all get out, and they were laughing and talking not only with each other but with American students. They were different people when they were out of the formal class environment, or what they perceived to be a formal class environment. My own class environment was very informal, but they perceived it, of course, as sit up straight and keep your mouth shut.
Mhm.
So that was one learning that was actually a very positive learning for me, with what was going to be the dramatically change in the approach to teaching. I can't say I have a whole lot of other experiences. I was aware of PowerPoint. I had friends who were using PowerPoint. What I had seen of PowerPoint was, frankly, rather negative. And it was rather negative because PowerPoint, at least as I knew it then, forced the learner to buy into the sequence of slides that the instructor had created.
Mhm.
And it did not leave much room for improvisation in class, and including the improvisation by the instructor. He or she tended to just march through their slides, maybe not using PowerPoint as it should be used. I don't know, but I had the feeling the whole thing was so structured that it didn't create the free flowing informal environment that I was always shooting for, a more conversational environment. If anybody is interested, I explored this metaphor of a conversational environment at some length in my chapter on the book called Researchers Hooked on Teaching by Peter Frost and Ray Andre, where they had interesting essays by various, basically OD professors, talking about their teaching style and how it came to be what it was. And one of the things that I talked about at some length in my essay was creating a conversational environment.
I remember I loved that book, and in part because it was one way of being in touch with you and people like Ray and Peter Frost, great people in our society. But what I'm picking up on, just to break your train here for a moment, is that the conversation, the informality, the ease of interaction, the moments of spontaneous discovery in person were the circumstances in which I worked best too, then and now. However, in between, from 2008, I went on teaching in the classroom up until 2016. The biggest thing I had to do was fight for on the ground and on the air, not one or the other, and blend it together into a seamless system so that the classroom time could become what we just talked about: exercises, sharing, bringing in people to talk about their practices. And that 75 minutes twice a week went very fast. But there was a ton of what I wrote and set up and scheduled on the learning management systems as they became known as, in this case, Blackboard. It took a lot of time to build each one of those modules and be available in the classroom. But the results, putting old technology, I guess you'd call it face-to-face conversation, with new technology, learning management systems, produce some pretty remarkable results. For example, your experience with the emails and how people tended to be able to talk in email better than they can sometimes speak in a large group. We had discussion tools, and I would structure the conversation somewhat, but I put everyone in that discussion school so they could see everyone else's answers to the various questions I would pose, and it became an enormous amount of data, if you will, of people sharing their points of view in writing. Some was terrified at first because they thought maybe their spelling wasn't all that great or whatever. But once they got into it and they could see the same people that they were with live during the week, continuing to reflect and help each other see things about management, organizational behavior in new ways online, it was pretty damn good. So maybe what we're inching our way into and looking at this conjecture about digitization is that there's a double-edged sword to this as well. If we can make the decision to go forward, in your case, you said, okay, this is good, I'm fine, 2008, I'll find other ways to carry on. But in my case, I really not only didn't have a choice, I was so intrigued about how I could make that system pay off for the students that I went way overboard.
Yeah.
So and one of the reasons I stopped is I knew that I just couldn't keep doing that because I had 100 and some students, and I was reading everything they wrote and building all these modules, pumping in videos and a bunch of other things. And people came and looked at my work, other faculty, and said, "It's really great, Dave, but it would take too much time. We wouldn't have any time to publish articles." Which is probably true. I, on the other hand, didn't care. I just wanted to do something magnificent as I was ending up that phase of my teaching. More thoughts on how technology, particularly the digital kind, which is what we're focusing on in this conjecture, is either affecting you post-teaching and or how you're seeing it affecting the state of practice overall, the big P.
Well, I have at least two reactions to what you've just said, and I don't want to lose them. But one thing you could call it a double-edged sword. What occurs to me is that, like lots of other things in practice, a lot of it depends on the practitioner's creativity in making use of the technology in service of the particular value system that the practitioner is practicing. And I would assume that most practitioners are shooting for a certain quality to their practice in relation to clients or in relation to colleagues or competitors, in relation to their materials. And I think our assumption is that the practitioner does indeed have has a love for his or her practice, his or her colleagues, competitors, clients, materials, that the practitioner is not just going through the motions and not just reading from the textbook, so to speak. We all know instructors in the teaching environment who read from the textbook.
Oh yeah, it's deadly. It's deadly.
But it's possible, I suspect, to be a practitioner of a lot of different things who just reads from the textbook or the user manual and does not attempt to enrich the potential of that technology or that methodology, that new methodology, with their own value system, their own passion for what they're doing. They're once again a confession. When I heard about putting everything on web pages, or putting what seemed like everything, wasn't everything, but putting everything about on web pages, and my instinctive reaction was, boy, I don't have to go through that. There are certainly practitioners whose attitude would be, boy, I wonder how I can enrich my practice with this new technology or methodology.
That's right.
So I would have had to learn my way into that approach if I were to stick with it. Initially, it looked like going backwards to me. The second thing I wanted to mention was back around podcast 3 or 4, we spent quite a bit of time talking about this metaphor of permanent whitewater.
Yes.
To describe the kinds of changes that we're all living through. And as members of the general public, the changes that we're living through, we receive as consumers and as observers. But practitioners don't have that luxury. They have to receive changes that are occurring in their environments as opportunities to enrich their practice and be more efficient or be more effective, or both. If they experience the potential for the new methods and new techniques as with dread and with a negative attitude, they are going to increasingly relegate themselves to irrelevancy, I'm afraid.
The sidelines, yeah.
That they will cease to be on the leading edge. Now, I'm fond of saying the other side of the leading edge is the abyss. If you think about it, everybody wants to be on the leading edge, but on the other side of the leading edge is the abyss. That is to say, the totality of things that might happen that one can imagine that constitute potential challenges to one's practice. There are fewer of us who want to be in the abyss. The reality is, in permanent whitewater, that we are constantly dealing with changes whose nature we don't perhaps understand, whose potential we may not understand, or may have an initial negative or resistant attitude to. And so permanent whitewater suggests that these changes, particularly as they are embodied in digitization, these changes are occurring in all directions at once, not as simple, linear, step-by-step processes. Wouldn't it be nice if software, for instance, proceeded neatly by step-by-step upgrades, as Microsoft is constantly telling me? But it's not a simple step-by-step linear process. It's a multi-step in multiple directions process, particularly with respect to the computer and respect to the software that goes with it. And we have to remember that there are all kinds of changes occurring that aren't necessarily technology.
It's true. Back to the system again, social tech.
Well, that's right. There are changes in the regulatory system, and there are changes we are now, and increasingly, if our podcasts go viral, as we fondly hope, people will be listening to them perhaps 3 or 4 years from now. And in 3 or 4 years, the panic over global warming will only have increased. And I think by say 2030, it's going to be perhaps the dominant thing on people's minds. And many of our listeners to these podcasts are going to be living directly through the global warming implications. And yet, what are they? They're permanent whitewater. They cut in all directions. They affect everything.
Everything.
Um, that that constitute one's practice. And it seems to me, just off the top of my head here, but it just seems to me that a practitioner today in 2019 would be well advised to sit down and try to anticipate the impacts on one's own practice of the global warming trends that one can perceive. What do dramatic changes in the weather affect? How do dramatic changes in the weather affect one's practice? How do dramatic changes in one's regulatory environment affect one's practice? What if we begin to get really serious banning of fossil fueled motors? To what extent does that affect one's practice? And in fact, the home health nurses that I employ there are a system of nurses who are driving all over the Twin Cities, each one putting on many miles a day in their gas-powered cars. And if the price of gasoline goes $5 a gallon or something or more, how does that affect their practice? Concrete things like that, it seems to me one would be well advised to try to anticipate the impact. And maybe extending that thought, not just global warming, but a variety of macro trends that one can see occurring. And where are these going to be 10 years from now? And how is that going to affect my practice? Seem to me to be useful questions that a practitioner might be asking now, even though I admit that I perfectly grant that even though you can't know for sure, and even though a lot of it's going to be wasted time. I mean, I remember back when the World Future Society was just getting going.
I remember that well.
Which was what, the 60s or 70s, I guess.
Late 60s, early 70s, yeah.
The thing that they kept talking about, which they saw sadly lacking in the leaders in our society, was a future consciousness, an orientation toward the future, a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to waste time and effort, a willingness to miss certain key trends or key events. But the whole orientation was toward the future. I think that's probably still true. That if you're, I remember an Exxon executive saying to me one time, for us, 20 years into the future is now. And I reflected on that a little bit, and I think the point the guy was making was that when you have a macro system like Exxon that you're worried about, ExxonMobil now, when you have a macro system, and that would apply to many different practices among our listeners, change the system in response to external changes in the environment is a major task. And you don't just flip a switch and suddenly have the new system that you were seeking. It's an agonizing process, more likely, of changing the system in order to keep up with changes in the environment. And yet it's permanent whitewater. So the beat goes on, the changes keep occurring. And there's no sandbar that you can pull out on and sit in the sun and crack a brew and talk about the changes you've just lived through. There aren't such sandbars in the real world of leading and managing organizations of all kinds, which is to say, fostering effective practice in organizations of all kinds. So I think the implication of what I'm saying is that digitization specifically, or all these changes in general, affect all of the practices that are present among our listeners, from doctors and lawyers and some of the more structured traditional practices to the new ones like web page designer, which is a key practice that didn't even exist 20 years ago. And yet I happen to have a nurse who has just taken a master's degree in what amounts to web page design. And hers is with specific reference to cartoon characters that make a point. And if you don't think that's not an important area of practice, just tune in on the cartoons that your kids are watching and take a look at the learning experiences that are being fostered with cartoon characters. Well, somebody has to draw all that stuff and has to get it onto a computer. And that's what she has committed herself to becoming good at. So those are some of the thoughts, Dave, that are triggered by your comments.
I just wanted to pick up on, well, a lot of that was right on, but that reference to the World Future Society and the complaint that leaders didn't have a future set of mind. I'm thinking, as I'm listening now and going forward, who in any practice can succeed without giving the future a tremendous amount of attention and space in their awareness. And when I was teaching, of course, I felt that very deeply for my students because I saw the corporate changes that were going on during the time I was teaching. I saw all the changes, and I also saw that by and large, those young people had a moment to moment, short term span of attention. And so I felt my obligation to prepare them as leaders was to do as much as I could creatively to get them to position their minds out as far into the future as I could get them to think. But now I see that in as a fundamental requirement for anyone who's teaching anyone at any age is yes, this is what we have now, and digitation has brought us to this point very rapidly.
And this is what's going to be in the blue book.
Right, but guess what?
Final.
Yeah, there is no
this
final.
Is how many pages your term paper is supposed to be.
Yeah, what could drive them crazy is what I say and mean, which is there is no final. There's no final in the way you've got to be learning to keep up and to stay on that leading edge.
That's a $10 thought, Dave.
There's no final. There's the title right there. And the other thing is that when we talked about all these macro changes, one thing that digitization has done, in my experience, is it has given us, through the use of our phones now, just like ask Siri. Whoops, she might come on by hearing that, and I could say, Siri, what's the temperature in Nome, Alaska today? And she could tell me, or through Google searches, she'll find it. So in a way, there we back to the good side of the source.
If she says 75, you go, whoops.
Which is probably true. Now, here's the contrast. We've had a heat wave, and it's still going on, but at the same time, up in Montana and Wyoming, where my daughter will be heading in a few weeks, it's snowing, and it's snowing big time. So that's kind of weird. We have 5 hurricanes brewing in the Atlantic.
End of the summer.
So I think
at the end of the summer, it's snowing big time.
It's snowing big time. So there's a lot of crazy stuff. But we do have, through technology, some means of being future oriented. We can be data gatherers and collectors. We can do all that to keep our practice viable.
That's a perfect example of what I was saying of you can have a creative orientation toward these changes, and you
Yes.
can ask, how can I enrich my practice with these changes? Often that's a very tough question when the change seems to be overwhelmingly negative relative to your practice.
It's negative, and in some cases, it takes us to a place back to that beginner again that we've literally never been before. And
Yep.
once you're there, you look around and to find others who are there and who know what's going on, and there are very few because of these sea changes that are happening so much faster. So this is the kind of the big challenge to the conjectures that we've done around learning. Digitization is pushing you out there so you can see what you don't know and get at it. On the other hand, you're going to get so far out into the uncertainty and the unknown that you might just want to run back to that sandbar and listen to Vale. He said there is no sandbar.
Yeah, waste your time looking for a sandbar.
So, what is the responsibility then of the practitioner as we're talking about this, Peter? What might we, because we're practitioners too, be doing to, well, as I would say back in my day, gird our loins for this fight, to stay
Back in
relevant?
your day, you were a Roman soldier, were you?
Yeah, I girded our loins. That was one of my old main upbringing kind of sayings. My grandmother would say, "Well, gird your loins and get out there because you got to shovel that snow."
Yeah.
But it's sort of a way of saying, okay, armor yourself, get yourself prepared, square yourself off, and proceed.
Until you hit an area where you don't know what you don't know, and
Yeah.
that's the scary part. It strikes me that many of our listeners to this podcast, they may be nodding their heads. I hope they are, but they may very well realizing that they have already lived through and absorbed much of the kind of change that we're talking about. And I would like to really reinforce that feeling. The feeling being the realization that one is already living through much of this and one is coping with it. It may not be like the practice that one envisioned for oneself when one was first starting out. It may not be that, and maybe it's dramatically different from that. But nevertheless, it is practice, and I am coping with it. And maybe what we're doing here is putting some language onto behavior that many practitioners have already developed. It's possible, going back to this way of thinking about practice that we have been harping on, where we say growing and changing oneself to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. Growing and changing oneself. And I suspect a lot of that has gone on and is going on among many of our listeners. But it's one thing to grow and change oneself kind of unconsciously, so to speak, where you just do it and move on. But there's another level in which you have to consciously grow and change yourself. You have to go back to school, so to speak. You frequently are in a feeling, you have a feeling of not knowing what you don't know, not even knowing what the right questions are, not even knowing what one should be doing with one's time. And that's where you may feel like you're spinning your wheels a little bit, or you may feel like your practice is evolving into something that you don't like as much. And you may even be feeling like dropping out of your practice. And what comes to mind with respect to that are the number of school teachers that America is losing every year.
That's terrible.
And who are taking the risk of the private sector or the public sector, trying to do something that they've never done before because their own practice, which they have loved, has become so bureaucratized and so politicized that they no longer feel like they're functioning effectively as a classroom teacher. And that's, to me, that's something we should be really concerned about.
Definitely.
Is that if the best people are leaving and those of lesser effectiveness are staying, you might get a long-term systemic decline in the quality of the work that's going on. And the Chinese have figured that out. I don't know if America has figured that out or not.
Not soon enough, I'm afraid. Oh, I just heard there's another large group of teachers who are going to be striking in Chicago. So teacher strikes in big cities. We've had statewide teacher strikes, and nursing unions are striking too. And I want to go also back to that seminal definition, that way of thinking about practice. Results. Intention to produce consistently results. See, the people we're talking about who were effective and now find they're up against that wall, they still want results. And they try and they try to get those results similar to what they could achieve before the change. They're not getting them. So they're not just quitting because it's a little too befuddling or complicated, or they want results. This is the key, I think, to those who aspire to build their practices and therefore build themselves. We love results. We like to see impact, the things we like to make a difference. So that's a really, back to your point earlier in the conversation, values kick in here a lot, don't they, Peter? Your personal values.
Certainly do. I guess I also want to add one new thought to our discussion of digitization. Back when we were talking, was it the last podcast or the podcast before the last one? In any event, to talk about how practice is a socio-technical system. The question that today's discussion of digitization raises in my mind is to what extent do we see the socio in all of these changes in the tech?
I know it's all whiz bang. We're like digi, everything's all cool tools and all that. You're right. It very much the fascination, as well as whatever requirements of the tech, could really pull us away from each other and away from even paying attention to our inner self or our collective self.
The experience I constantly have, being not terribly computer literate myself, is calling some expert over to where I'm working and saying, I can't get my screen to do this or that or the other things. Mm-hmm. And without any preliminary conversation or discussion, they lean over you and hit a few keys, bing, 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 and your screen suddenly does what you want it to. And you turn and you say, what did you just do? And they're already walking away.
Yeah, that's a good example.
No productive social interaction has occurred because the technically expert person doesn't perceive that to be important. What's important is just making the technology do what you want it to do. And too bad for those who don't get it. And I would simply counter that type of process by pointing out that almost every change in the technology or the methodology, whether it's hardware or software or wetware, as one of my colleagues used to call it, but referring to referring to the human beings in the system. Almost every change in those systems call forth a change in the social relationship that's going to occur when that new system is incorporated. People are going to have to talk to each other differently. Different people are going to be involved. The potential issues of conflict and misunderstanding are going to change. And every technology needs to be evaluated for those kinds of potential impacts. But of course, that doesn't happen.
No, because
And
we're moving right along.
the practitioner is pretty much left to figure out for themselves how to talk to the experts.
Even expertise itself is flashing by us in these white waters, Peter. It's almost cliche because you hear it so often, but when a person who's closer to our age is befuddled about something about their phone or about their computer, the point is ask a 13-year-old, ask a 12-year-old.
13-year-old asks a 6-year-old.
That's right. Because here's like a social point here. There's a whole generation now that were born from 2000 to today who always had digitization from the time before they were born, when they were
That's
using
right.
high tech,
That's a good point.
right to this moment. They are the digital generation. They're now in their late teens and into their 20s, and everyone in between. They're adapting, but we also don't know, to your point, how well their social life is evolving, if at all, regarding the real point of focusing so much on technology. I mean, your own grandson, who's what, 14, 15, his associations with his peers and everyone else has to be very different than when you and I were back in those days. I'm sure he's probably evolved at a level that he could easily look at your computer and fix it, and then he might even be kind enough to teach you what he did so you could do it for yourself.
Yes. And I can't resist pointing out that for the listeners to this podcast who, like you and me, call themselves teachers of organizational behavior issues, processes, to what extent are you defining some of these things we're talking about as the organizational behavior of the future? The organizational behavior of the future is conversations or non-conversations, so to speak, between highly developed experts and not so well developed user practitioners. And increasingly, practitioners are going to be going back to school for training, and they're going to be met with a expert at the front of the room who doesn't have any teaching skills.
Yeah, that's going on. That's happening right now.
Yeah, and so the young doctor who spends the summer trying to learn some whiz bang new piece of software is subjected to teaching styles and abilities that are primitive, to say the least. Mostly straight lecture.
Yeah, and one of the real frontiers in that regard, then, Peter, is how you can do teaching and learning at the same time, so that as someone is moving through the stages of discovery of this new way of performing, the teaching is at hand and synchronous or slightly asynchronous. And I've seen that trend. I'd love to figure out in the next life how I could be part of that, because the best part of that idea is I can be in close interaction with the learner at the very what we call the teachable moment. You remember that phrase we use?
Yes.
Teachable moment. Well, that doctor is very teachable when he or she's trying to learn something new, because they're going to have to put it to work They got to keep the income rolling in. So they have no choice. So if you could be right there by the side, either electronically or in person, to say, okay, now this, now that, now this, now that, you're in bit. I have the same struggle now with how to move our podcast up to the web. I have to find an expert who's patient enough to sit with me and work me through the steps. I've got to learn. I want to learn on at the time of the doing. And way back in the beginning of our conversations about practice, we said practice is in the doing. It's doing. It's action. So teaching, learning, and action all nicely packaged could be the way it's going to happen in the future. Not that we didn't talk about that years ago. We called it action learning and all kinds of phrases that we used. But now with digitization, to kind of round this out, digitization does allow us to do what you and I are doing right now. You in Minnesota, me in Connecticut, live. Thank God. It's good to be alive. And recording this and then putting it into another utilization. Got me going here, and we're out of time. So, final thoughts on conjectures about digitization of practice.
Just my modest building on what you just said, David. That digital generation, who are so apparently knowledgeable now, when in 10 years will be facing irrelevance if they don't engage in the kinds of creative learning processes that we've been talking about.
It's true.
You're not a member of I'm trying to think of a good phrase for it. You're not a member of a generation that is digitally knowledgeable for very long, just kind of on your own steam. That you're going to have to, as our working way of thinking says, you're going to have to consciously develop yourself as these changes go along in order to at least try to keep up with them. So that would be my thought, that nobody's exempt here from what we're talking about. Robotics is another huge topic that is going to be impacting a lot of the practices that encompassed by our listeners. And we haven't yet reached a robotic organizational behavior teacher, but we're getting kind of close to the amount of effort that's being spent on textbooks to say everything about the subject and to have all kinds of learning experiences embodied and to have CDs that go with the book and all of that, and DVDs and opportunities for online access to characters who are mentioned in the textbook. That all to me comes under the heading of robotics. And all I mean by that is that some system has been put in place of the spontaneous improvisation of a human being. Because robots, if they have any weaknesses at all, it's that maybe they don't spontaneously improvise. Now, maybe somebody who knows IBM's Big Blue chess playing system will tell me that the essence of Big Blue is the ability to improvise online.
Yeah.
And I confess I don't have an answer for that.
Well, they claim this artificial intelligence able to learn, which, in a very mechanical way, but it's coming. It's true. And so I think, to summarize in real quickly, I think, yes, artificial intelligence is on the rise. It's going to affect every generation positively and negatively. But I am an advocate for real intelligence, the kind that we're born with and we can continually develop throughout our lives. Back to that point, we get to change ourselves for the better intelligence. So, great conversation again. I look forward to the next one. We will probably push a little more deeply into this sort of conversation, but we all could go back and check out a few of our other conjectures to see how they stand now that we've worked together on these for several weeks. We shall see. Stay tuned, and thank you, Peter.
Oh, thank you, Dave.